The Infernal is unique for a demon in that it's not actually a demon and is more of an elemental. Their bodies are made of stone and then infused with fel magic, making them come to life, but evilly, since fel magic was used in their creation. And the demon is most often summoned in the form of a meteor crashing into a planet, and then crawling out from its crater to cause more havoc. And because of their unique way of summoning, the Infernal has been used in many of WoW cinematics. The Infernal starts off as a unit that the Dreadlords can summon in Warcraft 3, which has baseline spell immunity, an AoE that constantly pulsates around them, and they had the unique distinction where they were allowed to attack trees. So you could use Infernals to clear a path of trees for you. Sadly, this feature did not carry over when it was converted over to a World of Warcraft spell. In WoW, the Infernal started off as a very long cooldown where you could only use it once an hour. In order to learn how to use the Infernal, you had to find a book by farming mobs or by doing a questline. But the random drop book was added before the questline was, meaning some Warlocks already had the spell before the quest to obtain it was even added to the game. And to obtain the book, it dropped simply from killing Warlocks in the lower Blackrock Spire, and it dropped rather often. Now, the quest for it, added in patch 1.4, started off at level 55 and would send you to the Felwood to speak to an NPC named Nibby, the Almighty Gnome Warlock, who would then get you to speak to his imp, Impsy, who would be the one sending you on your quest to learn how to summon the Infernal. Impsy would then tell you of the flawless fel essence you would need to be able to reform the Infernal, sending you to kill satyrs in 3 zones, 2 of which were nearby. The third would be all the way over into the Blasted Lands outside the Dark Portal. Once you return, you'd use the items you collected to rekindle a powerful Infernal and get an Infernal Stone, which you would then give to Nibby in exchange for him teaching you how to summon your own Infernal, called Inferno, which was the name of the Infernal summoning. However, from then on, to summon Infernals, you would need to buy your own Infernal Stones from a reagent vendor. This quest also gave you a pretty decent offhand, but usually by the time you actually got around to doing this quest, it wasn't that great. In the Infernal's first form in Vanilla WoW, it wasn't super useful and only had niche uses, especially since it had a 1-hour cooldown. For one, it could only be used outside, and it was the only Warlock demon that had an outside requirement. That's because when you summon the demon, it would come down as a meteor and then do AoE damage to everything it hit, as well as stunning everything for 2 seconds. And since it came down as a meteor, obviously it had to only be usable outside. And for a short while, with the beginning of WoW, it would be summoned as a hostile minion, but was quickly changed to already be enslaved to the Warlock on summon. And instead, it would go around attacking whoever it hit with its initial AoE. And the Infernal had a constant fire AoE, just like its Warcraft 3 version, but was not immune to spells and just kind of punched things and didn't do very much damage, which means it didn't see very much use, especially since it had an outside requirement, of course. I'm sure if you could use it inside, it probably would have seen more use. One of the best ways to use this ability was in PvP, because in cases like in Alterac Valley, people would commonly overestimate its damage when it was summoned and try to focus it down, which made it act as a nice distraction so that you could attack them in addition to its stun and damage, of course. Another use of the ability was on low-level players of your own faction. Since it did constant AoE that didn't do very much damage to max-level players, it did more than enough damage to low-level players to be a real problem. And after 5 minutes, its enslavement would break on its own, and it would turn into a hostile NPC that would start attacking things at random, including nearby low-level players that happened to be of your own faction. So, one of the most useful ways to use an Infernal in Vanilla WoW was once an hour, you could maybe kill some low-level players of your faction. Now, since whenever you controlled the Infernal, it was under your Enslave Demon ability, the only real way to increase the damage of this ability was to take a talent in the demonology tree called Improve Enslaved Demon, which basically just lowered the penalty put on a demon under the effects of Enslaved Demon, as by baseline, Enslaved Demon would reduce their attack speed. So, if you wanted your Infernal to attack a little bit faster, you could take this talent. Although considering this talent was only useful for the Doomguard and Infernal, both of which had 1 hour long cooldowns, it wasn't really worth taking the talent. In the Burning Crusade, Blizzard didn't change Infernals, at all, despite it being in the expansion with the Burning Legion and Demons, although they did introduce a new Infernal model, which was more famously used for the boss Supremus in the Black Temple. In Wrath of the Lich King, Infernal finally saw some changes to make it a little bit more useful, as its cooldown was lowered to 20 minutes from 1 hour, and could finally be summoned indoors, meaning Warlocks could actually use it in raids now. But since the Infernal was still summoned under your Enslaved Demon ability, meaning it replaced your current pet, it still wasn't that useful. But at least it was more useful than useless, like it was in the past 2 expansions. Its duration was also lowered to 1 minute, so it could no longer turn hostile after its Enslave ended, and instead it would just despawn. And then later on in Wrath, it had its cooldown lowered to 10 minutes, down from 20, making it almost have a reasonable cooldown for the kind of effect it had, with the little caveat that it could not be used in arenas, of course. Then in Cataclysm, the Infernal saw the most amount of changes, as its name was changed from Inferno to Summon Infernal. It also no longer replaced your current pet, as it was summoned as a Guardian, but only lasted 45 seconds now, instead of the minute-long duration. And you could kind of tell the demon who to attack, as it would prefer targets with your Bane of Agony or Doom dot on them. And it was also in Cataclysm that you no longer had to do a quest chain in order to obtain the Infernal, as you could now just learn it from a Warlock trainer like everything else. And it no longer required an Infernal Stone as its reagent to summon. As with Cataclysm, they started removing reagents and class quests from the game. In Mists, it was changed to no longer prefer your Bane of Agony and Doom targets, and instead would just attack whatever was near it when you summoned it. And it was also given a duration of 1 minute instead of 45 seconds, so it lasted a little bit longer. Mists of Pandaria also saw the introduction of the Grimoire of Supremacy talent, which changed your Infernal into an Abyssal, which means it basically had the same abilities as before, except they were a little bit stronger, and it got a new character model when it was summoned. There is also this thing in MoP called the Green Fire questline, which was an incredibly hard solo challenge for Warlocks in order to change their spells green, which affected the Infernal and made it slightly darker green, and it also changed the Grimoire of Supremacy Infernal and made the Abyssal a super dark green instead of red, making it look a lot like the Warcraft 3 Infernal. In Warlords of Draenor, they added a talent called Demonic Servitude that allowed you to have the Infernal as a permanent pet instead of it being a cooldown. And once it was turned into a proper pet, it was given some actual abilities to use instead of just auto attack and AoE fire damage, where this new pet version of the Infernal still had its auto attack and AoE fire damage. In addition to that, it had a threat generation ability called Burning Presence, which also increased its chance to dodge and parry, which heavily implies they wanted you to use this pet as your tank, as well as an increase to its physical resistance, which is the complete opposite to its Warcraft 3 version, which was basically immune to spells. And it was also given 3 other abilities. The AoE fire damage Meteor Strike on a 1 minute cooldown, which dealt AoE fire damage and stun for 3 seconds, very similar to its original summoning condition. Torch Magic, a far more powerful version of the Imp's Purge magic, which would dispel a harmful magic effect on a friendly target and purge a magical effect from an enemy target. So it was a dispel and a purge all in one, even if its auto-cast version didn't work very well on allies. And finally, it had an ability called Seath, which was basically a taunt. With all of these new abilities, thanks to the Demonic Servitude talent, the Infernal became the go-to pet for tanking, as it was way stronger than the Voidwalker, and even the Felguard in some ways. It also got its model updated for Warlords of Draenor, however, it no longer worked with the Green Fire from the Green Fire quest chain. In Legion, the Demonic Servitude talent was changed to Grimoire of Supremacy, and worked basically the same way as it did in WoD, but with this change, the old Grimoire of Supremacy was removed from the game, including the Abyssal that Warlocks could summon in place of the Infernal when they used the talent. As for the non-Demonic Servitude version of Infernal, that also saw changes as it's got its cooldown lowered to 3 minutes and shared with Doomguard, making the Doomguard your go-to summon for single target, and the Infernal your go-to summon for AoE situations. Destruction Warlocks also had an artifact talent to summon 3 mini-Infernals on a 10-minute cooldown. In Legion, Blizzard also turned the Infernal into a mount. Kind of. More like, they used the Infernal's model for a mount, and didn't literally give Warlocks the ability to mount their Infernals. But with the Infernal-looking mounts in Legion, the Infernal became the first Warlock summonable pet to become a mount. There is the Dreadstalker mount from the Legion's Collector Edition, but those are simply a minion summoned by a demonology spell, and not a true summonable demon, like the demon pets. In Battle for Azeroth, Infernal was changed to a Destro-only cooldown and no longer had the option to be a permanent pet. It also went back to only doing auto attacks and its AoE damage, while now also giving you soul shards slowly over time. Destro Warlocks also have an Azerite Essence trait, which reduces the cooldown of Summon Infernal, and has a chance to randomly summon weaker versions of the Infernal for 35% of their normal duration. And they also changed Infernal to interact with the Warlock's Chaos Bolt, as there is another Azerite trait called Crashing Chaos, which reduces the Infernal cooldown and makes it so when you summon your Infernal, your next 8 Chaos Bolts do extra damage. As well as the Destro Warlock version of the Grimoire of Supremacy talent, making it so any soul shards you spend when your Infernal is summoned increases the damage of your Chaos Bolt by 8%. And that's it as far as the Infernal goes. The Infernal is currently a DPS cooldown for Destro only, and at least it's still in the game, unlike the Doomguard. And with this video, I have now covered all but one of the Warlock pets. So, if you want to watch the history of all the other Warlock pets, I'll have them linked at the end of this video, in a playlist with all my other History of Warcraft ability videos.